Good day, my name is KEEFTALK. This is my email address, that's the Twitter address, and I use Twitter all the time. Today is mid-April 2020 and we're experiencing, sad to say, the coronavirus crisis. Consequently, this KEEFTALK today relates very, very closely to this particular topic. And I'm going to try to explain why I felt for 45 plus years why health and being should be at the centre of our society and our education. I wrote this blog a few years ago, but I probably spent the last few decades rambling on trying to campaign to have health and well-being a much higher priority in our society. I hope you're convinced by the end of this that that's what we should be doing. It began really in 1974 when I went back to my old secondary school in Romford as a PE teacher. I'd managed to get a degree in chemistry at Lancaster University, which was no mean feat because I'd come from a disadvantaged area in East End of London, and people just didn't do that in those days. But they managed to persuade me to go back to my old school to teach PE, which was my passion, but actually also to teach science. And within a few years I began to be converted from mainly a PE teacher to mainly a science teacher. However, right at the start of this, I always wanted to see what I could do to help the people like myself who'd come from disadvantaged backgrounds and to discover what we could most do to help them achieve good health, well-being and life chances. And I was fortunate enough in the 20s to be one of those people who had been in that situation. And therefore, as a teacher, I wanted to discover how I could most help them to learn those skills that I felt that I was fortunate enough to be able to do. Now, the crucial part for me was a lot of research, and I had a lot of children in Romford who'd come from similar backgrounds to me and basically had many problems, perhaps many like I did, who I felt were symptoms and indicators, behaviours of what I would term vulnerable children, troubled children, people who had poor health and well-being. And so this board perhaps gives a number of the things that I picked up, that many of which applied to me, but I was detecting in the 70s that were very much prevalent in the troubled, vulnerable children that I was dealing with. And that chart for me perhaps brings home how little perhaps has changed, except it's got worse in the 40 years or so since I started making this research. Now, one of the things that I wanted to do in the late 70s was to try to find out what I could do to help them. So I created a thing which I called success philosophy, where I was studying the contrast between people who were successful and people who weren't. And this board reflects the people who I felt were successful, who had good health and well-being, and you'll see that they didn't commit crimes, they weren't antisocial, they kept calm in stressful situations, they were planned and organised. And when I became a head of year, my main focus in the year 7 was organisation and preparation, because I knew that that was going to be a big factor in whether they'll be able to cope with what life was going to throw at them. So this board really began to be a major factor in what I felt was perhaps at the heart of what we needed to focus upon. So in 1984, 10 years after I started teaching and researching this, I decided to do further research. I was lucky enough to be living in Brentwood in Essex, where we have Brentwood College, which has now become part of Anglia Ruskin University. But I did a part-time education, diploma in education, used to go Wednesday nights for a couple of years, and it was focusing upon personal, social and health education, which was ideal because obviously this was my passion and to some extent still is. But in those days we didn't really we had no internet, and I knew almost nothing about any books and research of that nature. This was all new to me, and so I discovered we had a World Health Organization. Didn't know that. And since 1948 they'd had this definition, which of course was brilliant for me. Health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being. Precisely what I'd been looking at for the previous 10 years, and not merely just not being injured or perhaps having disease or having some sort of cancer or infirmity. Consequently, I went back and looked at this, and I decided to discard being a head of department and focusing upon what they call pastoral care in schools. Bizarre name, but I became a head of year in the school in Chelmsford so that I can have a massive cohort that I could look at and decide how I could help them in a much broader cross section. And so consequently, vulnerable children became perhaps the things that I was most looking at when a child first arrived at secondary school. What could I detect that could cause them to perhaps be particularly vulnerable, and see if we could rectify that during a particular... And you'll see that if they had a negative attitude towards work, relying upon teachers and blaming other people all the time, easily distracted, dislike reading, dislike listening, those were things that I'd obviously was very well aware of by the mid-80s was actually going to be at the heart of what was going to cause them to become vulnerable and have poor health and well-being. By that stage, my two daughters had been born and were in their formative years, and consequently these were the things that I was trying to ensure with them, they're both teachers now, was going to be well in place. Consequently, I then decided that I should do further research throughout these 90s, and luckily there were other areas which I started to discover. And by the end of the 90s, a very important piece of research came to the fore, which was called Social Determinants of Health. And a man called Michael Marmot, who for me is a big person in this, and Richard Wilkinson, who I know less about, they published a book which you can see there is called The Solid Facts, which tried to convey good health involves reducing levels of educational failure. Of course, that's what I'd been doing before, and the amount of job insecurity and scale of indifference. So if we focused upon developing young children from a very young age, then we would be able to reduce the likelihood of them becoming poor health, poor well-being, etc. Now, he then later on wrote a book called The Status Syndrome, which I'd recommend to anybody. I've read it many times and recommended it to numerous people, and basically, as you can see there, he's been constructing the case to the degree of which you have control over your life. And I move over here, and then remember, everything that I do is always about these skills here. The control of your life and your opportunities depends upon these skills and these things being able to be established within a person. Now, what it means, love, is that for me, I was already 20-30 years have been focusing upon developing the whole child. And therefore, when in 2010 this recommendation came out, for me it was a really good boost to everything that I'd been banging on about for so many years. And particularly if you look at the first two, give every child the best start in life, passionately believe that we should be helping parents and teachers and everybody to understand that these 8 skills are what really matter right from the moment a child is born, so that we enable all our children, young people, to actually develop in a way with those 8 skills which is going to give them control over their lives. For me, it becomes very important to try to unpick, therefore, the World Health Organization advice about health and well-being. If we actually try to establish these 8 skills from our social, emotional, economic, physical environment, if health and well-being was our priority, these 8 skills would be at the heart of everything that we do in trying to develop our children. We can call them personal, individual characteristics and behaviours, call them skills, abilities. I don't give a monkey's what you call them, but those are the 8 areas that we need to be focusing upon. Following this, in 2008, I actually decided to write a book which I felt would be perhaps conveying to parents, teachers, anybody out there, why it's so important for us to be focusing upon this health and well-being and these skills. And so I wrote a book using Christmas Carol as the perhaps inspiration, whereby the young girl at the age of 11 doesn't have the help and support and development in these areas, so consequently her health and well-being deteriorates, something terrible, and therefore it illustrates why it is so important that we need to have developing and measuring what really matters, which are these things here, right at the heart of our society. And the follow-up to it was trying to illustrate how we can set up schools, learning success centres, which is what I called them this, whatever you want to call it, but health and well-being needs to be the priority, not academia and exams, but these 8 skills needs to be the priority. Hopefully that's been of something else to you, because at this moment in time when the crisis is so prevalent, we need to understand perhaps what we can do for the generations to come to try to prevent this disaster happening in the future. Thank you very much. I hope you tune in to others in the future. Goodbye.